Kalimera σας. So I want to tell you something today, because yesterday I had a liturgy for a very historic person, and I wrote to you about it in our echo, and very few people came. It was, to be honest with you, a little frightening how few people were there. But there were some people, so we had liturgy. But it told me that you don't know the importance of the person that I wanted you to come with me to honor. Now, if it had been a weekday or something, you say, well, we were working, we couldn't come, Father. But this was on a Saturday. And who is this person? His name is Saint Cosmas the Aetolian. You say, well, I never even heard of him. He can't be that important, you might say to me. So, since this is the political season, I thought I'll give you a little analogy. Think about one of the founders of our nation, somebody that we've all heard his name before. Perhaps we don't know very much about him, but we certainly know him as very important. And who would that person be? The very first president of the United States. And what is his name? Everybody knows his name, right? George Washington. How many states have been named after him? How many cities? How many mountains? How many roads? How many places have been named after him? And we honor him. And you might say, well, why do we honor him so much? I always want to know that. Well, one reason, I'm sure there are many reasons. He was a brilliant strategist, and he was a very good general. And of course, he won the Revolutionary War for the American forces against many odds. And it was considered to be very unlikely that the Americans would beat the British Empire. In fact, considered impossible. But nonetheless, they did win, as you know, otherwise we wouldn't be here standing in the United States of America. But why is he so remembered? Those are all important reasons. But the most important reason is when he served as president and he finished his term, he was asked to stay on. They said, we want to make you king. We want you to be the guy from now on until you die. Nobody's better than you, and we all love you and hold the country together. We're still a new country. You be our leader. And I was watching the other day that movie Napoleon. Maybe you saw it. Some of them are not suitable for children, but anyway, the theme of it was about Napoleon. And Napoleon started out, to be honest with you, not even political. He was a general, and then they asked him to be part of the political structure and to be one of the three governing Paris, and then no sooner did that happened, they decided to make him king, emperor, and he accepted. Big difference between George Washington and Napoleon. George Washington, when they gave him that offer, what did he say? No, I'm not going to do that because I want this country to be established on people who understand that this Constitution we wrote is real and has value, and in that Constitution it says I have a term limit, and I'm going to respect that. I'm going to respect all the people. I'm going to step down. So it was a point of humility. And he went into essentially retirement, meaning he stayed out of politics for the rest of his life. And for that reason, he is greatly honored as the first president of the United States. Now, why do I bring up all this? You probably know your civil history, so you don't need me to tell you that. But when we think about St. Cosmas de Telos, he is that pivotal. He is that pivotal to the life and history of the Greek people. You say, how is it possible, Father Paul, that someone so pivotal, I never heard of him? Well, I don't know the answer to that question, but it is true that most people have not heard of him. And when was he born? Around 1700. One of the reasons that I remembered to talk about the President of Washington is because you think that they were living at the same time period. And so, of course, one was living under the Ottoman yoke. The other one was living in this new country we now call America, but at the same time. Now, what did St. Cosmas do? Why do I say that he should be so honored? When St. Cosmas was a young man, he decided to go and become a monk. and he went to Agionoros, Mount Athos, and there he spent a good portion of his young adulthood. But while he was there, he had this kind of nagging feeling that he couldn't escape. And the feeling that he had was from the Lord, he felt, and it was, we have to go out and bring again the gospel to the people who by that point had been under the Turks for more than 200 years. From 1453 to say 1753, just to make so about approximately 300 years. Because I'm not saying the exact year that he was on Mount Athos, I don't know the exact year. So during that 300 years, the Greek Orthodox people had little time to learn their faith, to explore their faith, to be educated in any way about their faith, to not even learn the Greek language, to not learn even the language corrupted itself, I suppose you can say, because people weren't educated, and we formed what we now call the Demotic language. I don't mean to say that Demotic is a corrupted language, but anyway, it's a derivative of the ancient Greek. Anyway, so the people really had lost touch with their faith. Of course, they still had liturgies, they still had bishops, and the liturgies, if you've ever been to Greece, you know that all the churches, almost all the churches, without exception, are very small. Now, some of the ones that have been built since the Greek independence, or maybe even since World War II, are a little larger. But by and large, they're nothing like the cathedrals in Europe. They're small things. Why? Because that's all we were allowed to build. That's all we were allowed to build by the Turks. A little tiny thing. And sometimes those churches intentionally had very low doors. You say, why did they have low doors, Father Paul? Were the people shorter back then? No, it wasn't that. Maybe they were shorter. But that's not the reason they had low doors, but because the Turks would sometimes take their horses right into the church to degrade the Christians. And so they put the door low so they couldn't bring their horses into the church. So this is a difficult time. You all should know, and hopefully you do know, how hard was the Ottoman Empire against the Christians. If you converted, then everything was fine. You got tax discounts, you got to transfer your property to your children, you got to have education, you got to have even public aid, food, assistance of all kinds. But if you weren't, you suffered. So for 300 years, the Greeks had to live not just second-class citizens, but we say, and I think it's wise to say, like slaves. So then comes this man who knows this, and he says, something has to be done. And if no one's going to do it, I must be the one to do it. I've got to do it. So he gets a blessing from his abbot. He goes later to the patriarch. He gets another blessing to become an itinerant preacher. And from that time on, he has signed his own death warrant. And he goes from town to town to town within the Turkish Ottoman Empire, always seeking first the blessing of the Pasha, because there was no other way he could have preached. And he went from town to town preaching the very basic gospel of Jesus Christ. And he did it in the Demotic tongue. And he spoke to people in a way that they could understand. He spoke so simply. In all the sermons I've ever preached, I have never approached the simplicity and beauty of his sermons, nor do I ever anticipate that I will. He was able to do that because he was simple of heart. Not simple of mind, he was a very educated man and very intelligent, but simple of heart. And he went from town to town. And he started out in eastern Thrace. He worked his way across to western Thrace. He went and all of Greece, a little bit into what we now call New Macedonia, North Macedonia, Macedonia, of course, Thessaloniki, across Greece, finally up into Epirus region and in what is now called Albania. And everywhere he had tremendous success, wherever he went. And people came by the hundreds, if not thousands, to hear him speak. And wherever he would go, before he got there, he'd have a cross planted on the ground, a wooden cross. If you've ever been to Holy Cross Seminary, you'll see a cross just like that cross that he set up in its parking lot area, the beautiful cross, a wooden cross. He set it up, and the message was, tomorrow I will be giving a sermon. That's all. He didn't have to say any words. He put the cross and everybody knew. Tomorrow I'll be giving a sermon. So he would come, and all the people would gather to hear him speak. And what gracious words poured forth from his mouth. How loving and kind. And he taught people to care for each other. And he also instructed them in other things that are, maybe to some of us, they seem silly. Like, for instance, one of the things that maybe is a little bit silly, if you agreed to let your beard grow, he gave you a free comb. He wanted people to let their beards grow, especially the men. To let their beards, I don't know if women have beards. Anyway, to let their beards grow. So he would give away a free comb. And then he did other things to try to encourage people to follow the faith, to fast on Wednesday and Friday. Simple things. The people had fallen away from all those simple things. They didn't know them anymore. So simple things to return to them, to speak the Greek language. And he taught them about the faith. He said, we ascend to heaven with two wings. With prayer and fasting was one of his sermons. Another one, he said, we ascend to heaven with two wings, with humility and love. So he made everything very simple. And the people responded. And they came, but probably the most important thing, of course, all that he did was important. I don't mean to diminish it. Everywhere he went, he encouraged the Greeks to start schools. Did you know that? And who knew that? Did anybody here know that? Everywhere he went, he said, start a school. Instruct your children. They need to know the faith. They need to know the Greek language. They need to be able to understand the gospel. You've got to do this. And he had to do it in the most gentle way, because obviously he was already provoking the Turkish authorities. But he did it. And when he came to the end of his life, of course, he met a martyric end. We'll talk about that later. But when he came to the end of his life, 200 schools, over 200 schools had been established. So who is the father of the Greek nation, if not St. Cosmas? Who is the one who led the revival of Orthodox Christianity in the entire Balkans, if not St. Cosmas? In other words, we can count all kinds of saints if we want, but there always has to be a beginning. And for the Greeks under the Turkish occupation, that beginning, again, that second beginning, or new beginning, was none other than St. Cosmas de Atelos. He was that beginning. That's why we have to honor him. We wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for him. So when he was in his 70s, he died in the year 1779, so shortly after American independence, just to kind of give you some context. He was accused of being a rabble-rouser of some sort, and they killed him. I don't want to say because there are children here, but they killed him. And but he knew from the beginning that that was going to be his end. And he used to have this little wooden staff he carried with him everywhere, and that staff, I think, is preserved somewhere. And I think I told you not too long ago that Bishop Metropolitan Elias, who was Albanian and who who was the dean of students when I went to seminary, he told us a story how they found his relics. They found his very relics in Albania. And Bishop Elias, or Metropolitan Elias, said, those relics need to stay in Albania because that's where he died, to sanctify that place. And that by now there are a million Orthodox Christians in Albania, a place where all religion had been completely snuffed out. And we have to give credit also, again, to St. Cosmas. So you see how important it is to honor, I think anyway, I hope you agree with me, to honor those founders of our faith. Because we stand on their shoulders. We couldn't do anything that we do without them. You say, well, what about the Philokalia of St. Nicodemus? What language did St. Nicodemus write in if it wasn't the Greek language? How did he have an education? Who taught him those things? Where did they come from? Who preserved all that? So you have to have a beginner. So that is the man that I want us to, every year if possible, to stop and honor and thank for his contribution to our Holy Orthodox faith. Amen.